Welcome to Africa Express. Today we are going to South Africa. We will be talking with Ambassador Rakwena, who is the coordinator for the African Union Summit 2012. Ambassador, you are welcome to Africa Express.
Thank you very much.
And it's nice to see you again after last time we saw in Washington, I believe.
Yes, indeed. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
You have been working with the diaspora issue with the African Union. How did this come about? What prompted the African Union to start thinking about the diaspora?
Well, a bit of history and perspective is that, of course, the diaspora is not an exclusive to the African continent. The diaspora is a perennial issue that has always attached to various nations throughout the world. I think some of those better known ones would represent, for instance, the Jewish diaspora, the Indian diaspora, and so forth. Very little people reflect and go back to history and say, how is it that the Jewish state came into existence? The Jewish state came into existence, amongst others, through the formation of the people that were dispersed outside the Jewish state, who then formed themselves into a unit and found a way in which they could galvanize their efforts to try and rebuild the state of Israel to a very large degree. This they did in various measures. But suffice to say that of significance, if you look back in a 20-year existence at one stage, they were able, after establishing what was called the Jewish Diaspora Bond, to grow it up to a level of 26 billion US dollars. Now that's quite a sizable chunk of money through which you could then be able to rebuild the state institutions and stuff like that. The Indian diaspora has done itself proud in terms of what it has been able to do to rejuvenate the Indian economy through the nationals of India that are in foreign lands. They have been able to get involved in the pharmaceutical industry, which is becoming fast a giant in competition to the rest of the world. The IT industry, it is a known fact that the Indians have become very competitive in that particular environment. And all of this was spurred on by the role that these diasporans were able to play in terms of contributing back to the place of origin. So we speak about the African diaspora from a similar kind of perspective, in acknowledgement of the fact that indeed whilst the diaspora itself, the African diaspora, may have emerged from largely two factors. One, the transatlantic slave, indeed a period that was not only painful but cruel, inhuman, and certainly barbaric in terms of how the countries that were involved in slavery were able to industrialize through the subjugation of the African people. But the fact of the matter is that that's how Africans left the continent to a very large degree. In the second instance, of course, is voluntary migration with people seeking to better themselves economically, educationally, and otherwise. Now, this collective, which is a rich African ensemble of brains that is sitting out there. The question that in 2003, a year after the African Union was formed in Durban, what happened is then the question arose as to how do we tap into all of our resources. Clearly, one of the resources that had not hitherto been galvanized nor cohesively organized was the African diaspora. And the heads of states reflected and said, first of all, let's do two things. Let's recognize the African diaspora as an important element of the development process that we will have to undertake. Secondly, let's find a measure through which we can create a permanent process of dialogue and institutionalize the cooperation between ourselves as the African Union and the African diaspora. So this is how this evolved from that particular time.
I've heard people call the diaspora, or that is being recognized as the sixth region. Why the name the sixth region?
Well, the African Union, as it stands, hosts geographically the 5 regions: southern region, the eastern region, the west, north, and which one? And west, of course. And they are represented by various formations such as SADC, such as COMESA, and so forth and so forth. Now, it's in this sense that if you were to collectively ensure that there is an institutionalized manner of ensuring participation of people in the diaspora or Africans in the diaspora, without being naive and assuming that they exist as a monolithic group, because they are not a monolithic group. You know, we are not talking here a nation-state building, but we are talking a continental state building, so to speak. So there will be variants and a lot of divergences around that. The question is, how do you get them together to still work together in such a way that they could express a collective interest of the region, and by region I mean the continent. So in their formation, when this is to be done, when the process that leads to their organization is complete, we anticipate that the ideal state would be that institutionalized process may very well constitute what you then refer to as the sixth region. The measures and details of how that is to be formed is a process of negotiations that will occur.
You do realize that is a big project. You, as the coordinator, if you look around the world, there's so many of us. How, as the coordinator, how do you plan to get this whole project together, to engage all these diasporas as one unit?
Indeed. First of all, I should make it clear that I simply have the role of leading the process on behalf of the South African government, mainly because it is going to be the host, and consequently, therefore, for the African Union as the one that has got leadership on the project. Since 2003, what happened is that as part of civil society engagement, the AU put in place an institutional mechanism within its civil society group that hosts a program of the African diaspora. So in Addis Ababa already exists a complete directorate beyond me that then looks into how do you bring about all sorts of programs that will be able to deal with this question of the African diaspora. That's the first thing to say. Secondly, is that when we reel back to history, once the decision was taken in 2003 that this is the way we should go, what then happened to us that South Africa, together with the AU, as well as the Caribbean African diaspora states, hosted together what was then to be called the South Africa African Caribbean Diaspora Conference, which was hosted in Kingston in Jamaica. Out of that emerged outcomes that then defined how is it that the two, that is the African diaspora and the AU, will continue to coordinate with one another. So some work has already been done in the first instance. Emerging out of that particular conference, what also happened was that we put together a coordinating committee of African intellectuals and the African diaspora, which took place, the conference took place in Senegal. I think it was in 2006, if I'm not mistaken, or 2007, which then was followed up by the second conference of intellectuals in Brazil as an augmentation, in order to make sure that you have some clearer theoretical basis on which you construct this liaison and or dialogue that I'm talking about. And subsequent to that, there's also been several activities. We then decided that the world, the Africans are dispersed, as you correctly say, throughout the world. You're just not going to ideally sit there and say, just because we pronounce it shall be. We are not God. So we would have to do better than, we would have to do more than that, not better than that. I can't be seen as blasphemous and suggest that we could do better than God, but certainly we could do more than just being wishful about what it is that we wanted to do. So for this reason, we recognize the fact that in Europe there are Africans. So we put together what is called a regional coordinating committee for Europe, called in all of the countries that host African diasporas, and this, indeed, we would not be able to call each and every African that resides or lives there, but through their own formations and institutions, we were able to make contact with these, brought them together, and constructed what we call a regional coordinating committee out of that, through which then they will find participation and expression of their own interest through such an RCC or regional coordinating committee. That was in Europe. A similar process took place for North America, which then paid attention to both Canada and the USA, and a similar process of RCC took place in respect of Latin America, and that involved all the countries such as Brazil, which incidentally is a very important country, given the fact that it hosts, or of Brazil's population, more than 51% declares and affiliates itself as people of African descent. In other words, more than 50% of the population, for all intents and purposes, is African. And to that particular degree, that makes it the second largest African country in terms of size and population outside Nigeria. That's quite enormous. It is the largest African country outside the continent of Africa. So you can't possibly organize without the African diaspora without paying reference to that particular material fact. So that included all the Latin American countries. We then went to the Caribbean, like I said earlier, in 2005, and also held a conference there. I think it was in, if I'm not mistaken, in Barbados. The last one was then held in Addis Ababa, which was an all-inclusive one, just before the ministerial, to then constitute the African RCC, or Regional Coordinating Committee. So the organizational form is then in these RCCs, so that you have structures on the ground through which you could then be able to conduct this particular dialogue. It looks enormous and difficult, and yes, it is, but it is something that where you have a political will, it is possible to organize.
But one thing you mentioned the Brazilians, the Caribbeans. Some of them identify themselves as African descendants. Now, we know in the United States, a lot of Caribbeans do not identify themselves as Africans. The Latin America do not identify themselves as Africans. Now, how can we, or what kind of education can these people be offered to get them to start seeing or to identify themselves as Africans? Because again, the reality is in America, they do not, especially the Latin Americans, they don't think they are Africans.
Yeah.
So I see a bit, living in America, I see that a bit extending it.
No, that's there are two aspects to your question. The one is the one of identity.